forward to the cloud. Huzzah! Thank you, Chris. I used to work for Zoom. Um,
Perfect.
um, so, stepping back for a second, throughout the year, I've been going through various different open source and non-open source methods of um, of defining best practices guidance for open source projects and also cloud native projects in general, which I think is very relevant and inclusive of the scope of OpenJS projects. Um, and what's interesting is a few observations. One, as it's interesting to observe that one, the CNCF's guidance is absolutely fantastic. It does map to NIST guidance as well. It's not obvious in the documentation here, but in this level of documentation, but in other work products they have, a lot of the recommendations they make here do align um, to the NIST SSDF, which is the Secure Software Development Framework, which, if you notice here, was also something I wanted to do, but honestly, the mapping between all of these things and also mapping it them to the NIST SSDF was quite an exercise, and I had to cut myself off at some point because holy guacamole, it is a thing I would like to complete because I think it's actually really relevant and important. But for now, that it was just too much to do in Rev One. So, uh, looking through this, you'll see things are colored red, green, yellow, gray. Things that are green here are included in the standard. Their inclusion in the standard may not be word for word, though. So, in some cases, for example, like the best practices badge or scorecard might choose to measure something, a number of different ways. And so those measurement data points, I was not trying to mirror one for one, but instead to get the concept in there without it being just a mirror. Like, so I wasn't just mirroring other standards verbatim, especially since I was trying to gather up really what are we trying to get to here versus the OpenSSF scorecard and best practices badge are very focused on um, measurement. And that is a gap in the standard that I'll get to in a moment. So for all the rows of green you see here, and red and yellow, a lot of these things are in there anyway in different forms. And there's a mapping to where those are. It's not a perfect mapping because, again, some of these things are so aggregated together, or the way that things are carved up, it became a little bit laborious. But there is a mapping backwards. Items that are in red, I chose to not put into the standard, even though they could have been in the standard, because because maybe there were other alternatives from other sources that um, I think made more sense in context. Or so a lot of these reds actually contradict other guidance in different ways in other places. Also, things that were read that often things that are read are also things that were not technically related to security. Such in this case, you can see like license publication. For I took the security standard label for this quite literally and took a lot of that scope out of it because really, I think if we're generating a standards compliance document around security for projects within the foundation, I think it would make sense as a lesson learned from this exercise to make more targeted and focused standards and guidelines in those areas where they can be more thoughtful to the particular to that realm. So I would recommend something of a license standard or um, coding best practices standards and the like, because I really wanted to focus on the pure security aspect of this. You'll notice there's some things that are yellow here, and here's a couple of good ones. For example, using an SSO IDP for authentication. I couldn't agree more, but I felt that it was inappropriate to put that in there because that's a big budget ask and a whole change of way of working for the foundation that I think is a next generation, next step activity beyond the scope of this initial standard. Another one here is the project uses fuzzing. Oh, go ahead, Jordan.
Well, I just like I don't think it's just beyond the scope of this initial standard. SSO is already beyond the scope of whatever should apply to open source. Logging in with GitHub is effectively SSO. Like there's a lot of these things. I haven't looked through the colored sheet you're looking at, but I did spend some time looking through the um, OpenJS security compliance standard spreadsheet, and like a lot of these things are just not practical for any but the largest and most funded projects. And a lot of them have questionable security value. Um, that would be fine if there was no other downsides to them, but like if they add a lot of friction for contributors or maintainers, then at that point the security benefit has to outweigh the friction. And there's a lot of these things which ideologically are great, but when you apply that calculus, it doesn't math out.
Yep, I agree. And I'd also like to go through and identify the ones where, like, part of this feedback
Right.
cycle is I really tried to compress and remove as many of those concepts from the standard as possible, while at the same time not ignoring like if OpenJS creates a standard, it needs to be whole. It needs to be whole. It needs to be comprehensive but achievable. And so
Right.
there's a lot to talk about here on achievability, I think. And we can definitely go through that in a second because I agree with you, Jordan.
Yeah,
A
yeah,
lot
no,
of
no
these things
rush.
are
I,
just
I
not
left
feasible.
comments on that spreadsheet for whenever we get to it. I just wanted to call out like that's an important consideration.
Yes, absolutely. It's actually a top consideration for me. Another one here was fuzzing. I know, like with the OSTIF engagements that are going on that you guys are doing, they're generating fuzzers for projects. But at the moment, I mean, Jordan and I were chatting about this. The tool that they're using is deprecated and no longer supported. So there's challenges around fuzzing and JavaScript in general. And honestly, um, given the environment, given the language, I'm genuinely skeptical of the security value of having people implement fuzzers versus other things that they could potentially be doing. Even though these sorts of things like DAST uh, are actually a part of the passing grade for the best practices badge, while enforcing two-factor authentication is a part of the gold level for the best practices badge. If you found that, which is, yes, you can go check yourself. Running DAST is required for passing, and requiring MFA is a gold level thing. So rather than what I learned from going through these, and really especially going through the best practices badge, is the misalignment between the security risk and value of some of the activities that these frameworks are suggesting, um, versus the actual security impact of them. I would consider like MFA table stakes not like one of the last things you would do, but that is the way best practices badge does it right now. Um, so yeah, definitely check this out as a baseline. There's definitely things that could be included in here that I just chose not to, just to honestly to keep it shorter, because the intention of this list is to be achievable, not like in a week, not in a month, but it is genuinely meant to be achievable. And where it potentially is not achievable or it's unreasonable, I did my best to do a couple different things. So if we look over here on the left-hand side, excuse me, there's three columns. One is incubating, and this is reference to the impact that guidance item has on the process of that project graduating out of being an incubating project and into an active project. And the retiring project, you might notice it's retiring, not retired, because again, this guidance is assumed to be implemented as a part of the process for a project to be wound down. And I used incubating, active, and retiring just to keep things simple because I know there's name changes happening with all of this, and those can be aligned later. This was more to just communicate the concept as it is at the moment. So there's some things that, for example, OpenSSF has pushed quite hard on, like they did a whole activity for the Great MFA project, where they basically picked the top 100 projects, open source projects on the internet, and mailed people Google Titan keys so that their SSH keys and all that good stuff, they could actually enforce hardware MFA on these projects rather than having certificates sitting on a personal laptop, which is great. I totally support that, and I think it's a wise thing to do. However, given the reality of things cost $20, um, how do we decide who gets one and who does not, and the like? It's strictly recommended, and but it's there because it is a very reasonable to implement um, uh, solution, but at the same time, it has a huge monetary impact and logistical impact to get there. Things that there was a number of items where I felt that were not appropriate for the level of effort or the security value of the activity to potentially impact a project's ability to graduate from incubating to at large or impact, which I bundled together to just under active. In those cases, you'll see I said they were deferrable. Deferrable meaning that eventually they would be expected of the project, but at that moment and the decision point of graduation, they could be deferred. And these usually involve things that had a high human effort associated with them, but were still good to do. But maybe they weren't the most important things to do first. Under retiring, you also see NA. These are things that are just simply not relevant to a project that's about to be retired. For example, like the amount of activity for people associated with the project. Since it's retiring, it's not going to be relevant anymore. Um, and if we go down further to other areas such as SBOMs, again, things remain recommended. And the reason for that is the, and Jordan can speak to this, for hours very correctly in that the actual technical value for a project to implement SBOMs, a Node.js or NPM based project to implement SBOMs is quite low if they're only pushing JavaScript code. That said, if it's a full-blown JavaScript application, that's a different conversation. And so there are instances where I have specifically called out that this only makes sense for a freestanding application. And because of that caveat, I leave it strictly as recommended. I think as this evolves over time and we see how it gets implemented, some of these structural just choices are going to change. Um, One of the reasons I put ideas like only for freestanding applications or only for projects with two or more maintainers, the reasons I didn't make these columns is because looking at that other spreadsheet, the columns got wide super fast, and I think it really made consumption quite hard versus focusing in the putting that in the guidance itself. But I think eventually it makes sense as this matures and as things are added and shuffled around and as tools beside GitHub and NPM are included, which I would expect to happen in later revisions. Um, Another layer of structure would have to go on top of the item column, in which case we can look at um, pushing that more into a normalized field rather than just writing it into the item itself. One of the other things that um, we're doing as a part of the Sovereign Tech Fund funding is also producing guidance and standards around secure cybersecurity supply chain risk management, which encompasses a whole lot of ideas, but includes secure releases, dependency management, and the like. Um, I initially intended for those to be two separate documents, but as I wound up working through this, I noticed that the heavy hitters I kept coming upon were always related to supply chain security, because the real purpose of this is to help projects protect themselves and produce safe code that others can trust. That is at the peak of this. What this does not do is it does not tell them how to write secure software. And that's an intentional design. And the reason decision and the reason for that is that it's very can be very specific to the framework. That kind of guidance can be very specific to the framework used. And so I think that guidance makes sense to include as a part of the project itself. And that if that project relies on this library or this framework, rather than filling this up with every potential different scenario, like, oh, you're using this library, or you're using this framework, you need to do this, you need to do that, which would explode the size of the document. Um, I wanted to keep it to like the most common tools. So it focuses on when it gets specific in tooling and configuration, it sticks to NPM and it sticks to GitHub. There's certainly more tools that are more comprehensive, but those were the two to start with. Jordan, go.
Yeah, I mean, so actually for all three of these, I don't see why that they wouldn't apply to everyone. And like the first one, you just get as long as every change is merged to the repo before it's released. So like everyone kind of automatically qualifies for that. And the others seem like a good idea regardless. And then I'm sure you've looked through this guide that I wrote about going through the specifically the OpenSSF best practices badge program. And
Yep.
like a lot of the things on here are either checked off implicitly or easily or shouldn't be. Um, and I still think that this guide is correct or like not out of date rather. Um, so like it would be I think it would be helpful to sort of uh, at some point marry the two and figure out how many things you already get from this list by following that guide.
That's actually a great point, Jordan. My intention here is, and you can see one example here because it was most easy to reference, is that one of the things, reference points, the how-to column, I want that to be filled in with the guidance that, with
Hmm.
that guidance and reference back to OpenJS guidance whenever reasonably feasible. And if not OpenJS guidance, then other places. But not every single item here has a reference to documentation yet. That's not for a lack of documentation,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
more for a lack of wanting to find the right documentation for the item that
Hmm.
sends the right message. And in some cases, not being super happy with what I found and going like, okay, this is something where it's included in best practices badge. We're going to continue working on best practices badge guidance anyway. And so
Hmm.
then um, rather than trying to find somebody else's documentation that's like a 70% fit for what I would hope that how to look like, we can
Hmm.
include that in the best practices badge guidance directly and self-reference to our own
Yeah, yeah.
guidance.
That all sounds fine. And obviously, none of this has to be at a polished state at this point.
Yeah.
I imagine I was really just calling out that like some of the things it's good that you called out. It requires multiple maintainers to be relevant. I think for those three, it doesn't. It's relevant if you have one maintainer and potentially contributors. Uh, that was all. Yeah, there you go. 64 through 66.
Oh, I see. These.
Yeah,
Yep. I was I wanted to be really gentle on this.
fair
The
enough.
intention here was to be gentle. Above all, I wanted to present maintainers with something that they felt like they could achieve, and when they and like they could get it done, and they felt accomplished and recognized for doing that, and not a situation which happens very commonly right now, where they do amazing work, but for something that is very hard and very laborious to do, or something just not practically reasonable for them to do, is physically impossible just because of the fact that they're only one maintainer or something like that, that they are automatically punished and they will never reach 100%. The intention of this document is to reach 100%. And if there's something that reasonably
Awesome.
we cannot expect them to reach 100%, those are the items I want to like talk about, because my suspicion is that they can either get a caveat in some way, or we can rewrite the line um, to be achievable rather than the way it's written right now. But everything that's in here should be achievable. Nothing in here is aspirational. And frankly, I really wanted the message for this standard to be like, really, if you think about it, this is kind of table stakes stuff that everybody should be doing to protect themselves from threat actors and to produce safe code. Um, and so with that, you'll see that there's a lot of focus on really kind of the basic stuff on user authentication and account permissions and the like. Because what's interesting is that um, I'll use Scorecard for example here. Scorecard spends quite a bit of time trying to infer insider intentional insider risk by the diversity and sourcing, the diversity of maintainers in a project, and asking maintainers to associate their accounts with like their corporate emails so that they can, see that this person's actually like employed somewhere, and that's all well and good, but um, it didn't. The uptake and acknowledge and acceptance of those ideas, my sense is um, highly controversial. And the intention here was to not have anything that was controversial in implementation, and instead was focused on actually directly providing a control against the real concern. For intentional insider threat, there's really not a lot you can do without background checking people and the like. I think if in the documentation over here, through going through the assumptions section in particular, I directly linked OpenSSF's own internal discussions on their feelings on like how they implement their four eyes and six eyes checks and expectations. And the conversation is fascinating to read. And based upon the read of the conversation, if you did not know that they actually implemented these checks, you would walk away assuming that they did not. I think that's really important to recognize that the conversation is read. You would not draw the conclusion that this was a good idea, but they did it, and that's a choice they've made, and that's a choice that is clearly made to help Scorecard be a measure for third parties to assess an open source project from their own risk management perspective. And that's just simply not the purpose of this standard. This standard is meant, audience is entirely the maintainer on how they can protect themselves to produce against attack, against supply chain and threat actor attacks, and also so that they can have a reasonable baseline to produce safe software in the current environment. Um, there's some other interesting things in here that I'm going to be adding to this document that are not here today around vulnerability management and also around the expectations of open source projects in general. I think the standard really is intended to be aware of the reality of how good commercial organizations are at performing these activities themselves. There's a very real sense of going through all this that there's a double standard. It's very easy for commercial software vendors that are consuming open source to be able to throw stones, but at the same time, going through CISA data, from software application security, software vendor annual reports, the commercial organizations are not great at this stuff either. And so I'm not saying that it gives open source a pass, but instead I think it's important to moderate what is in the realm of possible, given that the average open source project is going to be a single maintainer, maybe a couple of people, is not going to have a security engineer, and certainly not going to have like the 5 software licenses needed to go do the sorts of security analysis that is expected out of a lot of these things. So, for example, reachability analysis and exploitability analysis, even with an entire product security work of hackers, it's a very challenging uh, analysis function. And I rarely trust the outputs of it when people say that, oh, we're not vulnerable, because um, usually there is always a way when people try hard enough. That's been my observation being in security my entire career. So instead, I try to be pragmatic about what tools are available to them, resources available to them, so they can get the outcome, the desired outcome, as reasonably quickly as possible. Um, you'll notice there is sourcing here throughout. Some of them just are missing because I haven't found what I felt was the best source to send the message for further lookups. There are other sources that I think are important that will be the foundation of this more later as it evolves, um, that are selectively put in here today just because it's just very challenging to map all of this. Overwhelmingly, the OWASP SCVS is the best high level model to use for this because really it's really quite comprehensive, but it's very conceptual. So we go check it out really quick. Rather than pushing everybody to make an SBOM that might be inaccurate or not very valuable, instead, SCVS goes into quite a bit of detail on the discrete activities that involve inventory, dependency inventory, and dependency management. And so it's these ideas that made it into the standard because these are activities that can be used using existing tools that we can provide guidance on as we evolve, without people having to buy something like Sneak or or something or something else. And that's the other big important thing here too, is that by default, it's quite possible in a regular commercial software engineering environment using a commercial tool, these tools would offer a pull request to fix the issue they find. Now, Step Security does have GitHub Actions for these sorts of things, but it's nowhere near comprehensive. And so I really, really hesitated on creating what was effectively a linter list of all the things you shouldn't do. And the only place I really did that in depth was GitHub workflow configuration. And most of that is around GitHub workflow configuration in terms of permissions rather than the best way to use GitHub workflows. And that's because, frankly, I didn't want to just make a guide on how to do GitHub workflows really well in this context because there's enormous amounts of documentation on this question already that's more broadly usable for lots of different projects, not just OpenJS projects. Jordan, I see you have these triangles here. I'd love to
Yeah.
get your sense and review of it. I really appreciate that you already went through and did some markups. What's your take on this?
I mean, overall, I think it's great. I think it's not in a format that's easy to consume, but that's not the stage you're at, so that's fine. Um, the we can go through the comments at some point if you want. Probably better to do it when we're not wasting a bunch of other people's time. But about half of those things are like this should be not at record. I read expected as required, and there's about half of them I felt shouldn't be required, and about half of them I felt shouldn't even be suggested. But of the things I commented, but I also commented a minority of things. So I think it's great overall. Just have some nits to pick.
Could you give me like a bit of a quick trend analysis? Give me your vibes on like where do you think it went well, where you think maybe it missed the mark.
I think it goes well in terms of its thoroughness and rigor. I think where it misses the mark is the same way that every official looking security document misses the mark, which is that it pretends everybody is working in a funded capitalist company, and it just totally ignores the actual realities of open source and then the practical trade-offs therein. Um, there's also, constantly a lot of security discussion around, well, this increases security, but if you can't actually point to a real exploit it would have prevented, then it's a much harder argument, I think, to make that it's actually increasing security. Um, and some of the things that are trendy in current security circles, I think, fall into that bucket. And then there's a lot of things that like two-factor is much more convenient now that passkeys are a thing and everyone has touch or face ID or something built into their phones, right? like I got sent those hardware keys and they're just a nightmare to use. I don't use them. I have them just in case, but like it just doesn't work well. But I do have two-factor everywhere. I just don't use a hardware key. Um, so like there's a lot of things where it's like if GitHub or all the platforms like implemented a thing natively, suddenly something that becomes not worth it can become a no-brainer, like table stakes. And two-factor has now bridged that gap. Um, so it's sort of it's difficult, clearly difficult for every one of us in the industry and ecosystem to truly consider holistically what things are uh, achievable, um, and under our control as opposed to under the control of others who are not in this channel.
I think I appreciate that, Jordan. The feedback is, I take your feedback quite seriously. So I'm looking forward to reading through what you have in there and adjusting. Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that, and this is, I think, quite relevant for documents like this and guidance like this, and that's Jordan's point about everybody makes the mistake of, or all things like this make the mistake of presuming everyone is working under a funded company. I think that that's even true for people working at funded companies working on projects like this, and that's something we shouldn't take for granted as well. A lot of times, even at massive companies, not that I would know anything about this from direct experience, but I've heard rumors that folks working on this stuff often look eerily similar to the folks that aren't working at such companies. And it's important that we don't assume anything about those individuals as well, and that the guidance works is broad enough to work in both of those situations.
Steve.
I was going to say, coming from a well-funded company, but not divulging how we do things, this mirrors probably what a lot of well-funded companies have internally as well, which is encouraging for those types of companies to see the effort here being put into. So I still think there's opportunity to make sure our open source maintainers and everything can actually deal with some of these, like Jordan's kind of alluding to. But in general, this is pretty powerful, I think, for your enterprise users to see. For at least that, like the efforts being put in and it's the correct way and it maps to a lot of the internal things that might happen at a large funded organization.
I appreciate the feedback. I take all of these as compliments. I feel like mission accomplished by this feedback, and so I think Jordan and I'm looking forward to going through the details and like flipping some bits on what's expected versus deferrable versus what's recommended to bring it to reality. Because the number one goal I set out for myself with this is that this is reasonably achievable and this will give the bang for the buck when they do it. But I mean, that's just my opinion. And so I expected there to be a Venn diagram. I'm actually really excited to go through that Venn diagram and just figure out those little gaps and just land it.
Yeah, I think maybe how the information is organized so we don't scare people away, layered. Be layered somewhere.
Yeah, and I mean, there's many ways to skin that particular cat, and that's like what I was thinking when I wrote the guide for the badge thing, is I wanted to be approachable for maintainer. So like I'm sure there is a way, probably very different than that this can be reworked into something more consumable and approachable, while containing the same advice. But that's we got to figure out what the meat is before we figure out how to serve it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's something that's come up quite a bit in these meetings and others, which is, you're trying to convince folks to adopt this or follow these guidelines, and there's a very, very low barrier for them to close the browser tab or what have you. So like the moment that somebody's looking at something and they see some content like, well, this is not going to apply to my project, you've probably lost them. They probably closed the tab. And so yeah, that's definitely something pay special attention to.
Yeah, Chris, if you wouldn't mind taking a look and kind of doing that sort of sanity check through it too, I'd appreciate it. Because I don't want to the I want to be able to include those things, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that they always have to be expected, right? Like we can create some amount of like gradation of yes, we officially believe you really should be doing this, but we understand that you're not going to go redo your entire, like, rebuild your entire CI pipeline for a 6-year-old project just to fit this
Right.
tomorrow. And so, like, what do we do to help those What I'd really love is like how to help those consumers, that
Yeah.
audience as well, be able to use this effectively.
Well, and that might result in creating multiple entry points to the same content where like imagine if npm init's first question was, is this an application you're deploying or a package you're publishing? Like the default package JSONs would be quite different between those two use cases and probably much more helpful for both, right? So like I'm envisioning something here where it's like, almost like a wizard where you're like, yes, I have an application. Yes, I publish to npm, or no, I don't. Like, and then that informs the advice and how we can package it.
All right, so columns it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways
Um,
to do the information architecture, right? But like ultimately, it's just something, regardless of what the precise shape of it is, generally, you know, start something that starts off with the low hanging fruit, right? The things that are like, if I'm a maintainer, I'm looking at, oh, I'm already doing this. I start to feel good about myself because I'm checking
exactly.
these things off. I don't want to start like number one is some like big pie in the sky thing. I know you're not trying to be aspirational. I really appreciate that goal, and I agree with that. But yeah, just in the information that's there and presented, the more that you can sort of hang your hat on and claim, oh, I'm doing good things because of these, and then maybe I'm not at these later state, more advanced things yet, but at least I'm here and I can see where I'm at, and also have a sense of like not as an all or nothing. Like I shouldn't, you don't want a maintainer to feel like, well, if they're not meeting these things, that they're might as well not even continued on the process.
Chris, based on, I know we're at time, but I have one more question for you. Though my conclusion, based upon what I just heard from you, is that we should consider a maturity model within this, like phase one, phase two, phase three,
Yeah, I mean,
perhaps.
yeah, I think that the I think crawl, walk, run, and so like I think it's the easiest thing at first is probably just to like sort of order them. Doesn't have to be
Mm,
perfect, right? But order them sort of easier to advance. And then once you take a look at that, maybe some groupings start to emerge. I know like Matt likes to talk about t-shirt sizes. You could talk about what was the best practices
no
does
problem.
like the gold and silver levels and stuff like that. Um, yeah, you could start looking at that sort of thing as well. I don't have strong feelings on what type of what which one of those types of options is more desirable than another. Um, but certainly the maturity model is actually like a slightly different. These are similar concepts, but I don't think they're quite the same. I think there's some subtle differences,
Okay.
things like a maturity model versus like the silver level go right. Those aren't like analogous, or are they in your mind?
Yeah.
They are. Okay.
I mean, best practice is bad. They effectively treat them as a maturity model
Okay. Okay. Then maybe we are talking
because
about the same thing.
best practice is bad will put something as suggested, then should, then must across for the same idea across all three levels. So they will take something, they
Okay.
will they throw a ton of stuff into passing that they say is suggested, which is the truly just as suggested, whereas in silver they'll say it should, which is really it must be, but we understand that there's going to be a ton of exceptions, and that's fine. But then when you reach gold, like, oh no, no more exceptions. You must do this.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. No, I think that that's helpful to do. because it gives folks that may never get to 100% compliance with everything, not to use that term loosely, it gives them something to hang their hat on and not go, oh, well, I'm
Right.
not checking all the boxes. So to give like a, you know, I've met the silver level or something, that's a meaningful,
Right.
you know, gold star on your lapel, if you will, or silver
That's
or
fair.
whatever.
No, it's really it's a good perspective. I hesitated on doing it, but I think it is the message I'm hearing is that we need to break this up a little bit more into like achievability buckets a little bit so that people can say, I've achieved this group and put a label to it. That seems to be a big part of what I'm hearing from y'all. So I will take that back. Chris, please do go through the list when you have a chance and tear it up like Jordan has, and I can just we can just start chatting about it and chat. Like we don't have to, I don't think we need meetings for a lot of this stuff. Looking at the feedback.
Okay. Sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Really appreciate the feedback. And I actually have one request. If anybody would like to stay, I have a quick engineering task. If anybody wants to sign up for a fun, quick engineering task, my request is that requirement one is to programmatically pull a list of every repo associated with an organization, with a GitHub, with the GitHub organization of every OpenJS Foundation project.
Boy, do
And
I have the
two,
software for you.
and then two, take that list and submit a pull request to the scorecard team so that they do automatic scans at their, internet-wide scans for those. I know Ulysses is going to be all over this. And then that way we can create at least a baseline of a dashboard ourselves to know where things are at. Obviously, you have to deploy the GitHub action to get all the data from scorecard and all that. That's totally true. But to get one huge, enormous list of by organization and repo across the foundation is a really great foundation for us to have some sense of where folks are at.
So this spreadsheet is all the foundation projects and including automatically scraping their OpenSSF scorecard or CII badge score and putting it into the spreadsheet and then adding a few other manual columns. So that seems like it could be a good start.
Yes, this is for scorecard itself. Like Google does scans like
No,
a
this is
million
for the
repos.
CII badge, but I mean, you could add,
Yeah.
you can use this list as a
Yes.
source of the repos.
Yes.
The URLs are directly in there. And similarly, you could even add a column if you wanted. I think I've given Ben permissions, but I can add you to the spreadsheet if you want to edit it. And you could add a scorecard column and then similarly automatically pull that from wherever GitHub repo you've computed and cached the results.
Ulysses?
Yeah, the idea was like to do a pull request against the OpenSSF for them to update like the cron job they have running on the project. Or okay.
Yeah.
That sounds interesting because in new news, I just got added as a member of the OpenSSF today because they officially accepted finally the donation of the monitoring tool and the visualizer that we built for the scorecard. So probably I will be very in touch this week with the scorecard maintainers and so on. So if you want, I can help you with that piece of the pull request for the cron job.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Scorecard is doing all this scanning anyway. At the surface level they could do. And so it's a great foundation to start just to give the foundation visibility and just to because I did look through and like some repos are there, but not all of them. So and they seem pretty chill with people submitting pull requests just to add repos to it, to the list, especially if you're showing up as like OpenJS, be like, hey, we love all of our stuff in the list. Here's all the lists. I'm sure they'd be very excited by that. So I'll follow you all offline on that one, but I appreciate you letting me go 10 minutes over. Thanks all, appreciate the feedback. Looking forward to seeing more feedback in the docs itself. And let's get this done. Anyway, have a great week and take care, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Toodles.